All right, Philip, we'll see you later.
Okay, so.
Thanks, Philip.
Bye, Dad.
It smells very fresh. Oh, here you are. Lots of pictures. You remember her? That doesn't do anything on. News. Look at that. Lynn Holiday and D.D. Moore to wed.
Well, I was born in Eden, Ohio. This was very close to the Ohio-Indiana state line. Eden was a small little community of probably 100 or 200 people. And I was born on May 10th, 1931, just at the beginning of the Depression. My father had grown up on a farm, and he had 4 brothers, and they were all very, very well versed in farming. He knew everything about farming. I mean, he was a good farmer. And I might add that my father I was born late in life. He was in his early 40s when I was born, and that was, for the time, very late. My mother was the disciplinarian in the house and had full charge of the children. My father spent all his time out on the farm working, keeping the house up, doing other things, and then we lost the farm when in another couple of years. And when I first had a memory of anything, we were on a sharecropping farm, and that was my first memories of actual farming, of butchering, of planting things, of gathering them in the fall, and going through the season.
I was born in Valparaiso, Indiana. It was a very snowy January night. The hospital was being renovated, and I was born at home with the local very good doctor, Dr. Fife.
Back home again in Indiana, and it seems that I can see the gleaming candlelight still shining bright through the sycamores for me.
wonderful house called a duplex, and we had the upstairs. And I know my bedroom had 14 windows, so it tells you it was a beautiful place.
Fields I used to roam when I dream about the moonlight on the Wabash. Then I long for my Indiana home.
Valparaiso was much more than, say, a farming community. It was a multifaceted town with a great deal of wealth. It had beautiful houses, wide boulevards. It was just a lovely, it was a classic small town, but not in the provincial, I have to get away from this sense. There were several manufacturing companies there. And many of the people there worked in Chicago, worked for Marshall Fields, worked in various companies in Chicago. It was a 50-mile train ride, and they'd come back at night. My father worked in Chicago. I'd always go down to the train station to meet him with my mother. My mother had been born in Valparaiso, and all of her relatives were there. Her mother, who was Danish, her grandmother, her mother's 5 or 6 Danish sisters, and her father, who was English, Stinchfield, and his relatives. So it was a vast number of relatives that were on my mother's side of the family, nothing on my father's side. And my mother married him. He'd been out of school he was 10 years older than my mother. He loved to read the newspaper. I always climb on his lap. And one thing I remember in particular about it, and this is a very early memory, is the way the newspaper smelled. I loved the way it smelled, and I loved the way the pages were turned. And from a very early age, I just adored reading the newspaper. So, he was a smart guy. He did sports writing for the Indianapolis Star. He was a writer in college. He had a real skill there. Might have wanted to be a journalist. And then he became a manufacturer's representative for Synthane Company. Of course, I was really little, so I don't know much about his career.
My father was a very, very relaxed man, and he never raised his voice to anyone, including my mother. He was just a lovely, lovely man, and Flossie was a strong woman, let's put it that way. My sister in those early years was very influential in my life. She played piano, she sang, she played the cello, but I've always admired her abilities, and she was really quite talented. In fact, she had a scholarship to a college, but even with the scholarship, we couldn't afford it. But I had an adopted sister who was much older than I was, June, and my parents had adopted her first before she had Marguerite and me later, because they were having difficulty having children.
My family life during the early years, I adored my grandparents. My grandfather was the local funeral director. That's my grandfather, Charles Stinchfield, my mother's father. Sunday night suppers at their house. We were a very close family. I'd love to go over and visit my grandmother one night a week and listen to radio programs with her. I also loved my grandmother's Danish sisters, who were just funny. I mean, they had all been seamstresses, or, they were Danish farmers who came to Valparaiso. But all those women made wonderful clothes, sometimes for very wealthy women in Chicago. But they'd get together and have a sewing club, and they just laughed all the time. My father's mother, I was not crazy about my grandmother Holiday. It's funny, when you're very young, you immediately know who's fun to be around, and she wasn't. My grandmother Ann was very pretty and humorous, and I didn't like the clothes my grandmother Holiday wore. From the time I was a very little girl, I hated her shoes and her hair.
The extended family of both my father and my mother was considerable. There were 7 in my mother's family and 9 in my father's family. Sundays were the day that you went to one of the brothers, it would be my aunts and uncle's house for dinner, usually a potluck. The women brought food, as well as the women who were the hostesses. And it was, they were all on farms, except just a couple of them. Practically everyone was on farms. By that time, I was being disciplined by my mother. My mother was a German Hausfrau who believed in absolute obedience. And if you didn't mind her, the fly swatter was her weapon. And I'll never forget my sister coming home from school one day, and she had gotten the rosin that you put on the strings of the cello on the floor and didn't clean it up. And I will never forget, because I was horrified. Here came Flossie, my mother, with the fly swatter, and I mean, on those bare legs of my sister, just whacked her, whacked her, whacked her all the way down the stairs to the basement where she completed the job. So we soon learned what discipline was in our household.
I love to be on the stage. I love to show off and be silly and noisy, and my sister Carol was not like that at all. I was in the kindergarten play. I got to be the good fairy in the kindergarten play and wear lipstick, and I had a beautiful dress, and I sang bells and drums in Soldiers Hall. I still remember. My grandfather once said, when we were still living in Valparaiso, and he was down on the corner, and I was 4 blocks away at his house, and he said, I could hear her all the way down the street.
Meaning you.
Yes. I can hear that voice. I can hear all the way down the street.
From Chicago, it's Don McNeil's Breakfast Club.
When I was very little, there was a radio program in Chicago called The Breakfast Club. And my mother and my father and I went to the Breakfast Club, and there was a thing on the Breakfast Club called A Fiction and Fact with Sam's Almanac. And my father, who was a great showman, programmed me to write my question down, and I got chosen to get up and stand in front of this whole audience and tell what my fiction and fact, this was at the Merchandise Mart, for Sam's Almanac was, which I cannot remember now. But I'll never forget, I had a pink dress on. It was just such a big deal that I got to stand up, and I was heard on the radio program all over the United States.
The first place I can remember living was on a farm that had a gas station. My mother told the story that when John Dillinger, who was the crime syndicate from Chicago, stopped at the gas station for gas. One night, he and 2 or 3 other black cars coming down this highway on their way to New York, and my mother recognized him right away. Her most famous client was the world's most famous gangster from Chicago. I never felt poor in any way as far as love, and we always had plenty to eat. We lived on a farm. My mother canned. We had cellars, storm cellars outside where she would fill them up with food for the winter in Indiana, which could be severe winters. And so there was never a shortage of anything really important. But I did start having little friends down the street about that time, so that was my first venture away from home. And my first girlfriend was about 6 or 7, and her name was Sheila Harmon, and she lived down, and we loved to play together. We had a wonderful time.
Anytime you choose, kick off your shoes, rest your weary eyes and catch up with the news. A favorite book will be the perfect company, so relax. Forget about the blues, you doing fine. Leave your cares and worries far behind. Loosen up your tie, let the world speed by, relax.
During which time there was one eventful thing that happened in my life which I will never forget, and that was at age 6 I had a ruptured appendix. And this was a time before penicillin. There were no drugs. And so I was taken to the hospital, and when they operated they saw that it was ruptured. And there wasn't really anything they could do to treat it. and it was touch and go. I mean, in those days, this was a fatal disease. On a Saturday, my sister came down to read to me, and I evidently went into a coma. We called a doctor, and the doctor said, there just isn't anything we can do. We'll just have to let nature take its course. And he took out the drainage out of my side and sewed me up. And that was the end of it, and fortunately, I survived.
Oh, the moon keeps shining on the one who waits for me. Back home in Indiana, neath the weeping.
After this third farm that we sharecropped, we moved into town because he just couldn't make any money. We had barely enough money to buy a house, but it was a big house right near the college in this town called Tri-State College, which is an engineering school primarily. Their thought was they would take in roomers, students who go to the college, as a room, not board, just rooms. The house was just, it was full of life because it was full of young people, and that was a really exciting part of my life too, because all of these guys played with me, all of the students that lived in our house, and they became like brothers almost, and there was just a constant stream for several years.
What was your father doing at this point?
This is the problem. He couldn't get a job. And this was probably the worst part, the worst time of his life, because he didn't have the farm, and the farm was his life. And as a result, I can remember my father laying on a couch, just plain down, so down that it shouldn't happen to anybody. And he never understood that it wasn't his fault.
We interrupt this program to take you to NBC Newsroom.
President Roosevelt said in a statement today that the Japanese have attacked the Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, from the air.
We were at my grandparents' house on December 7th having dinner. We went there every Sunday for dinner, and we always listened to Jack Benny's radio program. And they came into the program and announced that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese. And it was just a startling event, and all of us knew it.
We had been at June and Wayne's farm for dinner on a Sunday, and we were coming back in our car. We heard about it after we got back to Angola. It was maybe a 20-mile trip.
And then Roosevelt made a speech the next day. I remember having rationing. I remember you had gas tags on your cars for how much gas you could get. We kept ration books. Kids collected aluminum foil. We had newspaper drives. We had a victory garden. People started victory gardens to grow their own vegetables. And we were very aware of the war. It didn't impact us personally. No one in our immediate family was in the war, but we knew people who were called away who were in the war.
The war actually really changed everybody's life, and it certainly changed ours, because we moved away from our home, family, extended family, the whole thing. My father got a job in this defense plant as a welder. He was able to get a house trailer in a town, a little town near the defense plant that he worked in. We sold the house when I was in spring of the 6th grade, and I went to this little town, mother and I with him. He continued to work in the defense plant.
Transport of German troops by sea, which the Allies could impede but could not stop. The British Navy unable to control the narrow, perilous straits of the Skagerrak.
Headlines would come out every day on what was happening in the war. I collected them. I read about them. You'd go to the movies, and there'd be movie tone news, and it would be movies of the war. We were very aware of it.
These captured German films show the havoc wrought by concentrated air attack.
The underground forces of liberation knew their finest hour when the people of Paris rose to strike at the enemy.
It seemed like I was so tired of going to movies and seeing all these war things and seeing nothing but war pictures. And it was just very, very depressing. And I was about as happy as anything when that was over. It was,
Total victory.
I liked my mother very much. I adored my mother, and I adored my father. But it became very apparent that he had a drinking problem, and I recognized that as a child. And the kind of work he did, he was a manufacturer's representative, a salesman. Drinking was a big part of everybody's life then. And he was a great golfer, and I think he just, after he played golf, he went and had a few more drinks in the cocktail lounge, and he was an alcoholic, and he finally recognized it. But it took him a long time to recognize it. And in the meantime, we moved to Indianapolis. He was always full of great promise, great things were going to happen. Then we got down to Indianapolis, and of course we'd sold our house in Valparaiso. And we get to Indianapolis and we find out that money isn't there anymore. Don't know what happened, just gone. So we couldn't buy a house here, we had to rent a house. And Daddy was there and going to this new job, and I really don't know what it was or when it fell apart. But it didn't work out after a year, and then he was doing something like, this is what was so funny. Here we were, we had this black Buick, and he was, I cried, but I can't help but laugh. He had this big thing on the back of it. He'd go around and clean motors in people's cars out with. That was his next, and we were desperate by then. And the drinking did not work out, even though my mother encouraged him into Alcoholics Anonymous, which was very, very beginning years. And after 22 years of marriage, it just wasn't worth the insecurity of knowing if Daddy was going to show up or not. So when they got a divorce, it was on my 15th birthday, he moved to California to live with my grandmother Holiday, and I never saw him again.
In my daughter's eyes, I can see the future, a reflection of who I am and what will be. And though she'll grow and someday leave, maybe raise a family, when I'm gone, I hope you'll see how happy she made me. For I'll be there in my daughter's eyes.
I always had a job. I had to. If I wanted to get movie money, I would work for neighbor ladies, and I'd haul corn cobs, which is how they started their wood stoves. I set pins in a bowling alley. Delivering newspapers in LaPorte was a job. I started my own window washing company before I was old enough to get a permit. So I had about 5 different stores downtown. And then I think the first real job I worked in a dime store, stocking shelves. That was the first job that, I got paid once a week for, and it was a regular job.
My first job when I was 16. Murphy Dime Store was opening up in Broad Ripple, big new dime store, and they had a big training program, and a whole bunch of us went and applied. and got hired to be counter girls. But they liked me very much and put me in the office. And then all my friends quit and were having a wonderful summer. And it's the worst thing I've ever done. I thought, I really didn't want to be there working. And they said, you've got real potential. You can work here. You know, you can. And I lied to my mother and I told her I was fired.
What's that a picture of?
That's me when I worked one summer for the Pearson Music Company downtown in Indianapolis.
Because you're mine, the brightest star I see looks down my love and envies me because you're mine.
I was crazy about sports. I loved basketball. We had no sports for women, so what the girls did was go watch the boys play. I was a real tomboy from about 5th grade through 8th grade. We had a club called the Tom Sawyer Club, and there were like 6 girls, and we had to climb trees, ride our bikes over caterpillars, do all kinds of crazy things, getting into a lot of trouble.
Bad girl, what made me kiss you? Bad girl, what makes me miss you? For a time you took my love, then you gave my heart a show, and you told me to forget. I have tried so hard, and yet I'm still in love with you, and I don't know what I'll do. You're a bad, bad girl.
My father had saved enough money during the war, was making very good money, and he really wanted to go to California. So he bought a new house trailer, and it was a nice one. It was 24 feet long. I'll never forget it. My mother and my father and myself. And he planned this trip. He was just so excited about it. To him, it was like taking a trip around the world. And to me, it was, so excited. We were going to end up in Los Angeles.
Heading for the station with a pack on my back. I'm tired of transportation in the back of a hack. I love to hear the rhythm of the clickety-clack and hear the lonesome whistle, see the smoke from the stack.
We went from LaPorte, Indiana, which must have taken forever. It seemed like we would have a flat tire just about every day. And as a result, only way you could get a new tire or get a tire was to go to the junkyards. And we had spent most of our time all the way to California, which was a several months trip, getting tires and putting them on this car. I learned to put on a tire pretty well.
You reach your destination, but alas and alack, you need some compensation to get back in the black.
We were in Burbank. And I went to Burbank High School my sophomore year.
The only job that's open needs a man with a knack.
I moved around Los Angeles, and my parents allowed this with great freedom. I would hitchhike everywhere. I'd hitchhike every night from our trailer camp to Hollywood, where I would stand in line and get tickets for radio shows, which were free, and go in and see everybody. I mean, from Clark Gable to Frank Sinatra and it was all free. I love this, and that's how I literally spent. I never did my homework. And my parents never seemed to care.
I didn't have one friend who had a divorced parent, and to have a mother who worked. Oh. So I often said to my mother, you were ahead of your time, you got a divorce and you went to work. But we didn't have a dime. I mean, we didn't have anything. And she went to work, and we took in boarders. And finally, Carol said, Mother, why don't we ask some of the girls I went to DePauw University with, who are now moving to Indianapolis to work, to live with us? And that's what we did. So Carol went to DePauw for 2 years and then had to drop out at the end of 2 years because we didn't have any more money. And we had these 3 friends of ours who had graduated from DePauw move in with us. And it was the most fun I can ever remember, because then I had 4 sisters. And there was Peg going to work every day at the Banquet Milk Company, she was cashier with all these tough milkmen. It's a family friend got her the job, and she worked there all day, and then she'd come home at night and cook dinner for everybody. Well, finally, the girls, we all started participating.
I got this job after school, in high school, handyman around this used car lot. And I'll never forget the guy. He was just a real used car salesman, and man in his probably 50s, you know.
That car was worth around, $875. What? You're crazy.
When I wasn't polishing cars, he would let me be chauffeur to his wife and little daughter, about 3 or 4 years old. I would go over and drive him to Hollywood, where she loved to go and shop.
The shops are many and exciting. Hollywood signals many new trends in fashions.
And she'd go into a store and she'd say, pick me up in 45 minutes, you know. And so here I was, having the best time, you know, in a car in Hollywood, all by myself. Oh, it was wonderful.
There's no business like show business, like no business I know.
No business like it, everything about it is appealing.
Why, it's grand.
Everything the traffic will allow. Nowhere could you get that happy feeling.
You're a smash.
When you are stealing.
I was only there for 1 year. Worst part of it was that in LaPorte, I had gone through the freshman hazing at LaPorte High School as a freshman. It was a 4-year high school. But when I got to California, they had a 3-year high school. So I had to go through, as a sophomore, the whole hazing routine. And I remember they took all of the sophomore boys had to come down on a Saturday morning, and then we climbed the mountain behind the school, and we had to whitewash the big B up there for Burbank, made out of rocks, and that was part of the hazing process. And at the end of that 9 months of school, I had so many friends that we had a big party of about 20 of us who went to the beach because they knew I was leaving the next day to go back to the Midwest.
So what'd you do?
Oh, played volleyball and swam and just had a wonderful day. And we took the trolley out. So that's when it was. There was not a freeway in all of Los Angeles at that point.
So you were glad to leave?
I was devastated to leave. I hated to leave. In fact, I got in the backseat of the car the day we took off, and I cried all the way to San Francisco, begging to let me stay. I'd take care of myself. Let me stay. I don't want to go back to Angola, Indiana. It was my motivation for the rest of my life. It really was. I knew there was something out there that was beyond the limits of Angola, and I was going to get there by hook or by crook.
Hey, Daddy, I want a diamond ring, bracelet, everything. Daddy, you want to get the best for me, Leah, Leah.
Tell me about the plays you were in high school.
My freshman year, I was Daisy May. And I sang You Can't Get a Man with a Gun. And then there was a chorus of Daisyites behind me. And I have a big poster of that picture. Second year, I was in a trapeze act. We were all up on trapezes singing and hanging by our knees. But the big dramatic thing in high school was Janet Sage and I wrote an act called All Year Round. We designed all the costumes, we wrote all the songs. But it was a big high, and we directed it and staged it, and then the Indianapolis Star would come out and review the acts, and it run for 2 nights, and it was great fun. So that was theater directed. That was really still an interest for Janet and I.
Hey, listen to my story of a gal named Daisy May. Lazy Daisy May.
Daisy May was a big deal. To be chosen to be Daisy May was marvelous.
At times alarming, so they say.
Even before I graduated from school, I knew that I wanted to go to college. I knew it was my escape from the town. I knew that I had to do that for my own sanity. I had to somehow get there. So I applied to the Methodist Church, which was our church in Angola, for scholarship. And after getting all of the signatures, getting everything in order, and sending it off, it got lost in the mail. One of the most significant things that happened to me in my life when something got lost in the mail. I got down to the college. I was halfway through the first semester of my freshman year, and they called me in, and I still hadn't received the money. And the man was very unpleasant, and he said, we're not running a charity organization here, and you're going to have to pay to be here. And you're living in a dorm and all this. Even though I had a job immediately, a waiting table, I still can raise about $400 that I needed. And so I had to go to my sister, my adopted sister in Michigan, and they had a farm, and they were pretty tight with their money, and I managed to convince her husband to loan me $400 if I would pay interest on it, which I did. And I got through that freshman year, and I paid back the church loan, too.
My sister Carol had to drop out of school, and she was a terrific student. She'd gone to DePauw University to work at Eli Lilly in Indianapolis. But it was determined by Carol that I would go to college and she would send me. And that's exactly what she did. And my father sent me $25 a month. That was a lot then. And of course, I went first class. I pledged a sorority, more expensive, moved into a sorority house. But the thing that changed was because they were working so hard to send me to school, I felt like I had to major in something that would get me a job immediately. And I really should have been an English lit major. But I majored in elementary education because then if you graduated in that, you could teach anywhere in the United States. And I thought I had got to get that job so I can pay my sister and my mother back. And that's the only thing I'm sorry that anybody let me do that. They should have said to me, don't worry about that.
It was funny that I went as an art major because my senior year in high school, I took an art course, sort of as a lark. And this woman was very good, and she thought I had some talent and really spent a lot of time with me. And she encouraged me to be an art major. So that's what I did. It lasted one semester in college, and then I realized here I couldn't even pay my bills. I mean, I had to get a job, and I knew that the only way you get a job with common knowledge was to be a business major, so I became a business major real fast.
I love to read. I got to Indiana and I took these courses, and I took freshman literature, which is a very rigorous, good course. And I was twice Mr. Taplin had to be gone. He was a classic history boys type teacher. Rotund Englishman, a little spit here. And he'd asked me to teach the class when he wasn't there, and I did that twice.
Freshman?
Yeah, and I loved it. I mean, I just loved it. Oh, I also got exempted from composition in college. You had to take a test when you went to Indiana, write an essay. And I wrote an essay, and I was exempted from all 3 semesters because my essay was so good. Oh, and then I was going to major in journalism. I majored in radio for 1 semester. I remember going to a radio class. It was really mindless.
You, I'm in love with you. I could be so true to someone like you.
The truth is, I had a boyfriend in college who, probably if he'd asked me to marry him, and then I would have married him, but I'm glad I didn't.
Take me in your arms, please do.
The big decision in my life came with the Korean War. I truly considered joining the Navy. Then I didn't do it that summer, and when I went back to school, I got into the ROTC program, the Reserve Officers Training Program. I was in Air Force ROTC and graduated second lieutenant.
Most of the girls in my sorority house the year we graduated got married immediately, except for 2 people, myself and a very unattractive other girl. And I just knew I wanted to. Of course, I went to Chicago.
Life could be a dream if I could take you up in paradise up above. If you would tell me I'm the only one that you love, life could be a dream.
And I loved it. I was single for 4 more years.
My first stop in the Air Force was a supply school. The supply school for the Air Force was in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And I almost felt guilty. I had such a good time. I mean, we were there for about 6 weeks, and I would guess there were maybe 100 of us in this program. it was a picnic because United Airlines had just opened up the stewardess school in Cheyenne, Wyoming for all their stewardesses. This is where they train. And it was just like fire water. There was a meeting place downtown.
Oh, life could be a dream. Shaboom, if I could take you up in paradise up above.
And all the stewardesses were there at night, and all the second lieutenants were there at night, and it was a wonderful time.
Up in the morning and out to school. The teacher is teaching the golden rule.
Take the L to Wilmette every day, and of course I was 21 years old and the only single teacher in the school. And all these great teachers in the school encouraged me to get out of Wilmette. And so I told Mr. Bartlett, he said, Miss Holliday, you mean you're so good you're going to leave when you should finally be a good teacher? And I said, yes, I'm going to go to California.
Goes the bell.
Well, I didn't go to California. I had a friend who knew these three girls who had an apartment in the Gold Coast, and that's the place she wanted to live in Chicago. One of them was a model. One of them was a former American Airlines stewardess who was working for an ad agency. My friend Seymour came up from Seymour, Indiana, and moved in, so we had 4 girls in a one-bedroom apartment, split the rent, and it was just a party from one end to the other.
So they brought over 400 single secretaries who moved into all of the downtown old hotels in Wiesbaden. So it was like a house party for 2 years. So my service, I can't really say I ever did much for the Air Force, but I certainly got a good view of the world and a multinational view of the world. Lots of leaves, and I had a car that they had shipped over at that point, and so I was able to tour all of Europe a couple of times during the 2-year period that I was there.
C'est si bon de partir n'importe où, bras dessus, bras dessous, en chantant des chansons. C'est si bon de se dire des mots doux, de petits rien du tout, mais qui en disent en langue, en voyant notre mine ravie. Les passants dans la rue nous envient, c'est si bon de guetter dans ses yeux une esprit merveilleux qui donnait la frisson. C'est si bon, ces petites sensations, ça vaut mieux que millions. C'est tellement, tellement bon. C'est bon. C'est bon. Voilà, c'est bon.
The floor below us, there was a group of girls, and one of them was getting married, and her husband was moving out of his bachelor house, and Don was his replacement. And she said, I've met this wonderful young man named Don Moore, and he went to Indiana University. And she said, he has such nice manners.
Well, one of my friends said his fiancée was living with a young woman who was from Indiana, and he said she was a Pi Phi, and I remembered the Pi Phis.
I looked him up in the yearbook, and he was 3 years older. But I figured at that point, if I hadn't known him, maybe it wasn't worth knowing. I didn't know who he was.
And in fact, I even remembered who she was, vaguely, because they had, particularly the year that she had gotten they had a pledge class at the Pi Pi House, which was spectacular. I mean, there were like, they would seem to all be tall blondes. They were the talk of the campus, and I remember going through the pledge line and meeting all these tall blonde women, and one of them was Lynn.
And who would have known that while I'm standing there this day, a freshman in college, and my future husband's going through the line, and I didn't know it. He actually was more interested in one of my pledge sisters named Hazel Gano.
I hardly remember Hazel Gano, but yes, that's true. By fall, she had been planning a trip with a friend of hers to go to Europe for 2 or 3 months, a long trip.
But he kept saying, you ought to take the trip, and I said, okay, I did. And of course, when I got over there, I didn't think I wanted to come back. But he was great. He proposed to me by mail.
Why did you do that?
Oh, I just wanted to set the date and get it down, and I was ready to get married.
And why didn't you propose to her before she left for the trip?
I was busy. I was off in Acapulco and on a vacation and having a wonderful time. And I don't know, I just didn't.
And I answered and said yes. And then he and my mother immediately began to make all these wedding plans, which made me very nervous. They did not want a big wedding. They were writing about white dresses and where are we going to have it and what are we going to do. And I kept writing saying, you're rushing me too fast. I can't decide yet. I'll decide when I get home. And the funniest thing is he called me in Madrid to discuss this. I was very tight with money then. I'd saved all this money. And I hung up and I found out it was a collect call. And I wrote him a telegram and said, you owe me $28. I mean, I wanted that money. I had worked for that very hard.
Come bella c'è la luna, brilla strette, strette come butto, belle fasteggiare, sotto celle di Roma. Down each avenue, via street or strada, you can see them disappearing 2 by 2. On an evening in Rome.
How did that happen?
Well, Anthony you were named after an Italian I met on the boat coming back from Europe. Anthony Paisano.
On an evening in Rome.
So then I got back to Indianapolis and he and Mother were merrily planning this wedding and I just put a stop to it.
She was nervous about it. She wanted to. Of course, she's been nervous about everything her whole life. So I had to do some fast talking to make sure she didn't back out at the last minute.
She made it sound like you planned the whole wedding with her mom while she was gone.
It's true, we did.
Wasn't that a little presumptuous?
It was a very small wedding. It didn't take much planning. All we did was try to get her to set the time. I wanted to get married a couple of weeks after she got back, and she said, no, I need, a little breathing space there, so we made it a month after she got back.
We got married in the chapel at the Methodist Church, and it was just like very few friends. I wore beige. I did not want all that stuff. And
why not?
I just didn't. I was afraid. I was so afraid I'd appear domestic. I'd gotten really the other side of the rim by then. I didn't even, when we got married, I didn't want to buy a vacuum cleaner. I mean, I didn't want, Don said, Lynn, you have, I said, I don't care. I don't want those things. I don't want to be seen as a housewife. I'd go on the other extreme. And of course, I'd been living on the near north side, and he'd been living in Evanston with all these bachelors. And of all the times in our life when we should have lived in Chicago, he moves me out to Evanston after we get married. And, it was just...
You've never forgiven him for that.
I've never done that.
She wasn't admitting yet that she was married. She really wanted to be downtown where all the singles were, in the bars.
No, I wanted to be with you.
All of that sort of stuff.
I wanted to be with you downtown. I wanted to be alone.
Going to the chapel and we're gonna get married.
What is this?
This is the announcement. We were a big deal. That's the announcement of our getting married. There's me, Indianapolis Star.
Are you kidding? Look at that. What year?
1959.
1959.
1959. Both marriage vows will be said Saturday by Miss Hall.